Good morning, Western Australia. Welcome to our 2021 Census Data Seminar. Thanks for getting up early in WA for this seminar today. Early morning session, listening to some statisticians talk about some statistics. I'm sure that's on all of your bucket lists, so you can give that a big tick today. I am connecting today from Tasmania. So I'd like to acknowledge for Palawa people, traditional custodians of the lands, for seas, for waterways here in Tasmania, and pay my respects to their continuing culture, their elders past and present. I would also like to extend that acknowledgement to the Noongar Whadjuk people, the traditional custodians of the lands in Perth, where I know a number of you will be joining us from today, but also extend that acknowledgement for all of the traditional owners across our beautiful lands right across Australia. And a really special warm welcome to members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community that are joining us for today's seminar. My name's Duncan Young. I have what I think is one of the best jobs in Australia as the General Manager of a Census Division for the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And I'm joined today by Caroline Deans, who's the Director of 2021 Census Dissemination, in order for us to give you a bit of an overview of the census data from last year and the picture of that for Western Australia. How we'll run through this session today is we'll start with a little bit of an overview of the census. We'll talk about our conducting a census during a pandemic. Not sure I'd recommend it, but it's something that I think we did quite well in the end. I'll talk to you a bit about our response rates and our data quality. Then Caroline and I will team up to talk about our key data insights, and Caroline will talk through the release timeline, how to access all of the data that we're showing you today, and we'll have a great opportunity for you to ask some questions. To ask questions, we've got a service set up called PollEV. If you go to www.pollev.com/2021 Census DS Data Seminar, then a WA on the end, you'll be able to submit your questions, and then we'll be able to, we'll have one of our lovely team pick up those questions and ask those of us towards the end of the session. We will sort of repeat this URL as we go through the slideshow in case you missed it, but you can go to that on your phone or on your computer, pollev.com/2021 Census DS for Data Seminar WA. Okay, so running a census, it's an interesting undertaking. It's an undertaking which actually takes the ABS 7 years to do each time, and we've run censuses every 5 years since 1961. So we're always have at least a couple of censuses underway at any point in time. As you can see on that slide today, logistically, it's a bigger event and a big undertaking. Think about the size of Western Australia, the distribution of population across that state. It's no wonder that our field staff travel over 10 million kilometres in collecting census data. We do try and make the census completely inclusive of every single person in Australia. And so we translated material in over 44 languages, including Auslan. And a big call out for Auslan for 2021. We actually changed one of the questions in the census to ask households about what language do they use at home rather than speak at home, to make sure that Auslan speakers understood that it's really important that their language skills are captured in the census. And we found that 16,242 Australians used Auslan in their own home. We also posted 13.6 million items across the country. Now that's a lot of stamps to lick. But the census is always challenging, but in 2021 had the particular challenge of being conducted during the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic. As I'm sure you'll remember, that the WA border restrictions were in place at the time, and were in fact in place for a total of about 697 days, I believe, Eve. So it was certainly something that we needed to work with when we conducted the census. We needed to adapt our approaches to make sure that we were keeping our staff safe, but also a community safe, whilst also collecting great data. Probably understandably, we were a bit nervous leading up to the census that maybe COVID-19 might lead to a poorer census because of the restrictions in place. In fact, probably the opposite occurred. We did see increases in response rates, which I'll touch on later, but probably even more importantly, the census managed to capture a greater proportion of the Australian population than we've seen in previous censuses. So some of this aren't things that the ABS did well. We just conducted a census at a fortuitous time. So usually in a census, we miss out on the data from every Australian that's travelling overseas temporarily. And in 2016, there were 600,000 Australians, more than half the population of Perth, if they were all from Perth, were out of Australia at census time. Whereas in 2021, it was under 40,000. So that's 560,000 Australians, but due to COVID, were grounded in Australia at census time, and their data has contributed to what we think is the most complete census we've collected in a modern kind of time. Also, in general, across the country, more Australians were at home, not travelling within the country at census time. There are a few exceptions for that, and Western Australia was one of those exceptions. So whilst there were border controls in place, there was still an ability for people to come in across the borders through the right channels in order to travel around Western Australia. And so Western Australia actually saw a 10% increase in the number of people from out of state travelling around the state at census time compared to 2016. And so it was sort of, I guess, the number one destination location for temporary visitors during the census in terms of proportional change. So lots of people in WA at the time. We did see on the other side, though, the number of international visitors drop. So what does all this mean for quality of a census? Well, we measure the quality of a census in a few different ways. Probably the headline measure is always our response rate. So what percentage of occupied private homes have completed census forms? And what you can see on this slide here is that the numbers for Western Australia and Australia are both above 96%, slightly higher in Western Australia. And this is a fantastic result. Our target was 95%, so well above the target there. The Western Australian response rate in 2016 was 94.6%, so a really good improvement in the response rate to the census in 2021. So thank you everyone in WA. The second measure we have is a measure of undercount, or net undercount. A net undercount is the percentage of population that we believe has been missed by the census. And so this figure is created by running a follow-up survey after the census, where we go out to some 50,000 households and ask them where they were on census night. And by linking that data up with the census, we can work out how many people were counted twice and how many people were missed by the census. And what we saw in 2021 was the undercount for Australia at 0.7% was the lowest that we've ever seen in an Australian census. And the net undercount or overcount of states and territories tend to be a little bit higher or lower because of the smaller sizes of those jurisdictions. And the net undercount of WA was 3%. So that means at the end of a census, when we the ABS produced the population estimates for Western Australia, we needed to add 3% extra people into the count. Finally, I mentioned the online response rate. We get higher quality data where people fill out the online form. It takes people to the questions they need to fill out and reminds them if they leave questions blank. So we do get higher quality data in the online form. And the Western Australian figure for the online form was very pleasing at 82.4%. This was up from 61.5% in 2016. So that means that about half of people in 2016 but still completed on paper and not on the online form switched across to an online form in 2021, a really great aid improvement, and it's given us a great foundation of data for the 2021 census. Enough about the census. Let's jump into what the census actually showed us about Western Australia and the Western Australian people. So firstly, Here's a bit of a national kind of snapshot of it. 25,422,788 people we counted in Australia, which discounts off the overseas visitors. So these are people who usually live in Australia. This was an increase across Australia of 8.6%. And what you can see on this is, graphic is the increase in percentage by each state and territory. And you can see that ACT have taken the crown as the fastest growing territory between the last two censuses with 14.4%. That's twice in a row that ACT have held that crown. Western Australia, with an increase of 7.5%, is a little bit lower than the national change, quite similar to New South Wales, and above South Australia and the Northern Territory, which only had a 1.6% increase over the last 5 years. Now, stepping into this from a Western Australia perspective, we can see that actually that increase from 2016 to 2021 is a bit of a slowing in increase compared to what we saw in 2016, which was a little bit smaller increase to a really big increase we saw in the 2011 census. But overall, if we wind back 50 years to 1971, in 1971, can you believe it, Western Australia had less than 1 million people in total across the whole state. And we're getting up towards nearly triple the size over the course of 50 years. In the same period of time, Australia's only doubled in size. So Western Australia has certainly been a bit of a destination location over the last 50 years. Now, one of the great things about the census is to be able to zoom in a little bit closer to get a more detailed picture of a country. And so what you can see here is WA's divided up into smaller areas, which are called statistical area threes. And so we use these statistical areas in order to allow us to have consistent comparison over time. Some of the other boundaries, things like the edges of suburbs or postcodes or local government areas, can change over time. So the statistical areas allow us a more consistent basis for comparison between censuses. And there's about 350 SA3s in Australia, and they vary in size from about 20,000 people, or usually outside of cities, up to about 150,000 in cities. And we try and design the areas based on population. That's why you can see that the SA3s outside of Perth are quite big. The ones in Perth will be much smaller. And Western Australia, one of the unique characteristics of Western Australia as a state is the concentration of population in Perth. Nearly 80% of the population, 79.6%, are in Perth. That compares to 2/3 of the population in capital cities is across the whole of the country. So it is the state with the greatest concentration in the capital city. So what we'll see during this presentation is we'll often zoom from this kind of more macro view of a whole state into a more detailed picture of the capital city area of Perth. So what this particular graphic shows you on the two sides is a change in population counts on the left and the change in dwelling counts on the right. And green means a decrease and red means an increase. Not quite sure why we use the colours that way around, but the darker the green, the bigger the increase, the darker the red, but the greater the increase. And so what you can see here on the left-hand side is there was quite a significant decrease in population in the West Pilbara region. So decrease of about 14% of population down to just under 30,000. And then down sort of, obviously out of the Kalgoorlie kind of way with the Goldfields region, a decrease of 2%, and then into the wheat belt area, a 4.3% decrease. Dwelling numbers don't decrease near as much as the population, because most of the dwellings are permanent, whether or not they're in use or not. The biggest area of growth we saw was in the Augusta, Margaret River, Busselton SA3, so down south of Perth there, with a growth in population of 12.7% and an increase in some of dwellings of 3,700, or about 14%. And interestingly, in this area, we saw 26% of the dwellings were unoccupied on census night, compared to only about 10% of dwellings across Australia. In this area, the Augusta itself had the highest growth rate, and a growth rate of over 21%. Looking at this broader region, which has grown from 51,000 people to 58,000 people, a few characteristics of this area. It's an older population, a median of 44 years, which is 6 years older than the state, and an increase of 3 years since 2016. So that area has aged quite quickly over that 5-year period. Usually we see changes of sort of 1 or 2 between censuses. So it's probably had a number of people move into the area of older age, as well as a number of people staying in that area. As you'd expect with an older population, there's a higher proportion of empty nesters in that area. Nearly 46% of families there are couples without children, compared to just under 39% for Western Australia and Australia. And almost 90% in that area live in a separate house, compared to 72% for Australia, and more are owned outright or with a mortgage than the rest of Western Australia. Let's zoom in a little bit to the greater Perth kind of region. And what we can see here is that there's no patches of green. So there's been in growth right across the Perth region. Areas of significant growth have been in the Serpentine-Jarrahdale region, where there's been an increase in population of around 20% to over 32,000, and 18% increase in Armidale to over 94,000. And dwelling increases in the same area of about 15%. You can see in a few areas there, for example, down south of Perth, the dwelling count hasn't increased by as much as the population count because of a lighter colour. So that means that there must be a greater level of occupancy now of the homes, either more people in each home or less homes unoccupied. But often what we see in areas which are growing are some different characteristics. So if we zoom in a little bit on Serpentine-Jarrahdale, it is a younger and a healthier population. 83% of family households, 51% are married. There's an average of 3 people per household, so much higher levels of occupancy than the state overall. 97.5% of these dwellings are separate houses, and 63% are owned with a mortgage, not owned outright or rented. So, and we're seeing in this area higher median mortgage repayment rates than the rest of WA, but also higher median weekly incomes. All right, I might hand over now to Caroline to step a little bit more into the age breakdown of the Western Australian population.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And yes, I'm going to start by talking about age pyramids, which would have to be a demographer's best friend. So for those of you who aren't familiar with age pyramids, let me explain what we're seeing on the screen here. On the left of the screen are males broken into 5-year cohorts up to the age of 85 plus, and on the right are females. This is an age pyramid for 2001, and each one of those bars on that graph represents the proportion of the population that age sex cohort is. So if we look at the males in particular, we can see that the largest cohorts of males are both in those teenage years from 10 to 14 and 15 to 19. So right down the bottom of the graph there, and also a little bit older in the 35 to 39 and 40 to 44-year-olds. So that's where there are most males, or sorry, I should say were most males. This is 2001. And if we look at the females, it's mainly at that upper age limit of the 35 to 39. It's not the same number of female children in 2001. The other thing that we can see in here is that the median age back in 2001 in Western Australia was 34, a little bit younger than the Australian median, which was 35. Now going to move on to something more interesting, and that's the 2021 data. So what I've got here is I'm overlaying in that teal colour the bars that represent the population of Western Australia in 2021, and as you would expect across a 20-year period, there have been quite a few shifts. The largest age sex cohorts now on the male side are in the 30s. So the 30 to 34 and the 35 to 39 are the largest cohorts on the male side, and not the same number of teenagers that we saw 20 years prior. And on the female side, it's a little bit younger in the 30s, and again, not the same number of children. So there have been a number of changes to the patterns in the last 20 years. We can see by just comparing the orange bar to the teal bar, a real decrease in the proportion of teenagers and, to a lesser extent, the proportion of children. There are also proportionately fewer people in their 40s and early 50s, and an increase in the proportion of all age groups of 55 plus. And the median age in 2021 was 38, which is the same as the Australian median. And I haven't got a map to show this, but what I can talk about is some of the differences that we see across the state in terms of median ages. And Duncan has been talking about Serpentine Jarendale, which is also the youngest SA3, Statistical Area 3, in Western Australia. The median age of that SA3 is 34, so quite a bit younger. And we can see when we look at that area, a lot more children and young teenagers than a lot of people in their 30s, and proportionally fewer in their 50s. And so lots of families down in that region. Then at the other end of the scale in Western Australia, the highest median age is in Manjimup. And when I look at the profile of that area, a lot more people aged 50 plus, mainly couples and mainly without children. And then also older areas of Western Australia are the wheat belt, both north and south, with median ages of 46 and 47. So much diversity across the state in terms of the age distribution. Now, you might have noticed on that chart that I had male and female. When we're talking about the population figures, we report on male and female. But if you remember when you filled in your census form last year, you might recall that there was a third response option, and that was the response option of non-binary sex. But what we have done is that data isn't available as part of the regular output. So all of the census data that you'll find will have male and female only. And for those people who responded with that non-binary sex option, they will be derived into either a male or female value. And what we'll be doing is releasing a separate article on the characteristics of the people who responded with non-binary sex over the next couple of months. And the reason we have done that is to make sure that the data isn't misinterpreted. So when we think about the responses to non-binary sex and the way the question was asked, we don't consider that data accurate enough to be used. We don't want it to be misinterpreted. So that's why whenever you're analysing the data and when you're looking at population data in general, it will all be on a male and female basis. And to get more information on the non-binary sex responding population, you'll need to look at that separate article that will be coming out sometime in the next couple of months. Moving on now to talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And first, just looking at how that has changed over time. And these are the last three census cycles, 2011, 2016, and 2021. For Western Australia, and we've seen an increase of about 10% from 2011 to 2016 in the number of people identifying as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and then a bigger increase between 2016 and 2021 to 16.7%, which is actually much lower than the Australian increase, which is about 25%. But the state of play now in Western Australia is that there's about 89,000 people in 2021 who identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and that now represents 3.3% of the population. I'm going to just show you how those growth rates have changed and how the numbers look across the country of people identifying as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So we still see that the majority of Indigenous people still live in New South Wales and Queensland, with 278,000 in New South Wales and 237,000 in Queensland, out of a total population that is now 813,000. And although Northern Territory has the greatest proportion of its population identifies Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, the numbers there are smaller because it's a less populous territory. On the right of the column there, you can see the growth over the last 5 years, and it has been quite varied across the country. The Australian average growth was 25.2%. As I said before, the Western Australia growth was a bit below that, 16.7. Most other jurisdictions were in their 20s, except for Victoria and Australian Capital Territory were 37.5%, but off a very low base. And Northern Territory didn't see that much increase at all. So 4.9% growth in the Northern Territory Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. Going back to Western Australia now, I'm just putting that on a graph to show how that has changed over time. And we're now looking back to 1991. And on the left is the count. So the number of people who identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander was about 42,000 back in 91, more than doubled to 89,000 this census cycle, and just that steady increase, as you can see, except a little bit of a plateauing. Now I look at it from 2001 to 2006. On the right, that same data, but shown as a percentage of the total population. And because, as Duncan said, there's been quite an increase in the population of Western Australia over the last 30 years, you can see that proportion hasn't gone up to the same extent. Now, a map. So again, I'm starting out at that more macro view of all of Western Australia, and again, looking at the statistical area 3. This is a really nice shading on this graph, and probably quite a expected shading. So you can see right up in the north in the Kimberley, the 41.1% of people who live in that SA3 identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and then it decreases a little bit the further south that you get, and to the lowest rate in the regional areas is in the Augusta, Margaret River, Busselton area, where the rate is about 1.8%. And zooming in now to the Perth Greater Metropolitan Area, and again, we can see lower rates of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people being identified, less than 3% throughout most of the metropolitan area, with a couple of exceptions being Kwinana, Swan and Mandarin are all about just over 4%. So what does the age profile look like for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Again, this is half an age pyramid, similar to what I showed before, but we're not separating it into male and female. And we're just showing here in the lighter peach colour the proportion of people in each age cohort in 2011, so 10 years ago, and then how that increased in 2021. And you can see that there are proportionately more people now at the upper age cohorts, so 55 up. There are more of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population in Western Australia are now of that age, and smaller proportions at the sort of in the under 20s in particular. And the median age is much lower than the Australian median. As I said, the Australian median is 38. In the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population in Western Australia, it's 24 years old. Now I'm going to present a slide on housing suitability. So you may be familiar with the Closing the Gap targets, which are set to help policymakers and service providers measure the success in how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are being serviced over time. And one of the targets is around housing suitability. And one of the goals is about increasing the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are living in appropriately sized houses to 88%. So appropriately sized means not overcrowded. And that means we don't need any extra bedrooms for the number of people that are usually resident in that house. So the goal there is by 2031, so in 10 years' time, to increase it to 88%. And that's an Australian target. And you can see down the bottom in the bold, Australia has now achieved 81.4%, which is up from 78.9% in 2016. And you can see that the Western Australia figures have also increased up to 78.8%. And in fact, most of the jurisdictions have shown an increase over the last 5 years. The exceptions were the ACT and Tasmania, but a really big increase in the Northern Territory and increases across all other states as well. Moving on now to talk about cultural diversity, and the census asks a lot of questions about your country of birth, or where your parents were born, the languages that you use, and the ancestry that you identify with. And all of that can be combined together to paint a really good picture of the cultural diversity of our communities. And I'm just going to go through a few of those measures today. And Western Australia is really fascinating when we look at the cultural diversity data. And I'm going to start off with a pie chart that describes the generations and what proportion of the Western Australian people are in each of the generations. So first generation they're the people who are living in Western Australia now, so counted in the census last year, and they themselves were born overseas. So more than a third, 34.2% of people in Western Australia were born overseas, much higher than the Australian rate of 29.3%. Then the next chunk of that pie, the second generation, are those whose parents were born overseas. That's another 25%. So, and again, that is higher than the Australian number of 22%. So overall, we can see that those two orange shaded parts of the pie are well over half the pie. So more than half of Western Australians, well over half of Western Australians, were either born overseas themselves or had their parents born overseas. So quite a different picture to what we see when we look at the Australia level data, and also really different picture to what you see in some of the other jurisdictions. Queensland, I recall, for example, the charts almost flipped the other way. So really interesting data about the diversity in Western Australia. So let's look more at that diversity. And so we ask a question: what country was the person born in? And even though it is a diverse state, most people were still born in Australia. 1.6 million Western Australians were born in Australia, and that represents 62% of the population. So much lower than we see at the Australian data. And then the second most commonly reported country of birth is England, again, much higher than the Australian average, followed by New Zealand, India, South Africa, the Philippines, and Malaysia. Of those top 7 that we've got there, where we've seen the biggest growth is actually in the Indian-born population. So it's now 61,000 people in Western Australia were born in India, and that's increased by about 50% on the number of Indian-born five years ago. And not in the top 5 yet, but one of the fastest growing population groups is people who were born in Bhutan, and that had tripled from about 1,300 to about 4,500 people. And another really fast growing area right next door to Bhutan is Nepal. And so people who were born in Nepal increased from about 1,420 up to about 4,500. So they're two of the really fast growing regions where people living in Western Australia are now born in, but they're not in the top top 7 yet. Show you another map of Western Australia, and this one is also quite interesting. What we're showing here is the proportion of people in each of those SA3s who were born overseas. And unlike most of the maps of regional Australia that we show, we actually see quite a proportion of people in the regions of Western Australia who were born overseas. And you can see that represented by those darker orange colours, in particular East Pilbara, the Goldfields, and the Augusta Margaret River Busselton area. All of them have England and New Zealand as their countries of birth. And now zooming in on the Perth region, and some really dark colours represented in these SA3s, showing some areas that have quite a high proportion of people who are born overseas. And the highest was in the SA3 of Canning, where more than half the population, 50.4% of people, were born overseas, and closely behind that was Gosnells, 44%. And Canning was driven by people who were born in India, but also quite a few people born in Malaysia, and there's some Chinese and Singaporean born in Canning as well. Gosnells was a similar sort of makeup, with mainly India and Malaysian born, and also the Philippines. So that's what we can see when we look at the Greater Perth area, and where there are more culturally diverse populations. This next graph here shows, of the people who are born overseas, what year did they actually arrive in Australia? And we're just looking at the last few years back to 2016. You can in fact get this data well back. So actually we ask, what year did you arrive in Australia? So the data can go well back to, I arrived in Australia in 1974. So that's what I reported. And if you want to know how many people arrived in 1974, that data is all available in the census. But having a look at Western Australia and the last 5 years, we've colour-coded this graph to represent the, pre-pandemic years and then the pandemic years, because the patterns are quite different. So all those teal-coloured bars are the number of people who arrived from overseas and are now living in Western Australia. So 20-something thousand a year, each year, from 2016 up to that peak of nearly 30,000 in 2019. And each of those years represented about 8 or 9% of the total number of people arriving in Australia from overseas, were arriving or now living in Western Australia. And then we've got the years where we've been more affected by the pandemic. And in 2020, there was still about 13,000 people arrived from overseas in 2020. We don't ask month of arrival, but possibly quite a number of them arrived in the first few months of the year before we really locked down all the borders. And that number there, that 13,000, is about 10.5% of all arrivals in Australia that year. And then what I thought was really striking is when we look at the 2021 data. Now, this only goes up to the 10th of August, which was the date of the census last year, and just over 4,300 people arrived in Australia to WA last year. But that actually represents more than 20% of all people who arrived in Australia. The total number coming into Australia was about 38,500. So a really big jump in the proportion of people settling in Western Australia from overseas, probably because of most of the borders were really shut last year to international visitors or international arrivals. And another measure of cultural diversity is the languages that we use at home. And in 1991, about 86% of the population of Western Australia only used English at home. Of those who did use another language, Italian was the most common, followed by Cantonese, German, Aboriginal languages, and Vietnamese. Then if we fast forward 30 years to 2021, there's now fewer people, so about 3/4 of Western Australians use English only at home. And of those who do use another language, Mandarin is now the top spoken language. Italian's still well up there, and you can see Vietnamese, Punjabi, Cantonese are rounding out that top 5. And it's interesting to see that the Aboriginal languages made that top 5 in 1991. So having a look at how that compares to 2021, and the Aboriginal languages is now decreased to 0.2% of all people in Western Australia use an Aboriginal language at home. Another question that we ask about in census is a person's religious affiliation. And again, having a look at this over time. This graph here is of all of Australia, and we're looking back over the last 50 years of people's reported religious affiliation. That orange bar at the top, that's decreasing from about 85% down to 43.5, are the various Christian denominations all totaled together in that orange bar, and seeing that decrease to 43.5% of the population. The dark green bar, which was less than 10% back in 1971 and is now 38.9%, is those who reported that they had no religious affiliation. So that includes people who ticked the no religion box, but it also includes people who identified that they had another spiritual belief or a secular type belief. So some people write in that they're atheist, for example. And so that is reflected in that no religion line, that dark green line, which now is about 38.9%. And that light green bar creeping up down the bottom is all the other religions, which includes the Islam and Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, etc. And at an Australia level, that's now up to about 10% of the population. But let's look at it for Western Australia. And again, looking over time, we're not going back quite as far, going back to 1986 on this graph, and breaking down those religions a little bit more. So here, the dark green, the dark teal bar is again no religion, and Western Australia has a higher rate of reported no religion than Australia. So 42.9% of people in Western Australia reported in last year's census that they had no religious affiliation. Then we can see the dark orange, the light orange, and the yellow bars are the various Christian denominations, which are slowly decreasing over time as a proportion. So the dark orange bar there is Catholicism, which was 18.7% in 2021. And the yellow bar is Anglican, and the peach-coloured bar is all the other religions combined. And right down the bottom of the chart, making up only about 3% of the population in Western Australia are the Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism. So Islam is the highest of those, which is 2.55%, and there's only been a slight growth in that over the last period since 1986. So that's all I've got to say about the cultural diversity of the Western Australia population. And I'm going to hand back to Duncan now, who's going to take us through some of the new questions that were on last year's census.
Thanks, Caroline. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you about the couple of new questions we've got on the 2021 census. Probably the only thing which gets statisticians more excited about than normal census data is census data on new questions. And we hadn't had any new questions in the census since 2006. So it was quite a special opportunity for us in 2021 to add some new topics to the census. And the first of the two new topics I'm going to talk about is long-term health conditions. On this slide in front of you now, you can see that the question that was asked in the census. So has person one or the person's name been told by a doctor or nurse that they have any of these long-term health conditions. So as you can see here, there's a list of 10 different health conditions that they could select. They can select one condition or they can select multiple conditions. And so we'll share a little bit of this data in a minute, and it's really, what's really amazing about for Census is that this data can now be looked at to understand smaller groups of a population, particular age groups, particular cultural backgrounds, particular regions of a country. We can zoom in on the data in ways that we can't from the health data that the ABS produces from surveys, which do give a richer and more detailed picture at a national level and state level of each different condition, but don't allow us to understand these population groups with the same level of granularity. So if you are interested in the health data from a census and keen to use it, we'd like you to have a look on our website at a conceptual article we've put up, which helps explain the concepts collected in this question and what its strengths and limitations are compared to the data collected from other sources. This data from a census, whilst it's just one question, we've developed a number of different variables which allow you to analyse this data. There's counts of each condition, but also one of the most interesting things I think is the combination of these health conditions together into defined comorbidities. For example, looking at people with asthma and a lung condition, or looking at people with diabetes and heart disease. So a really rich amount of data here. And one of the things that I'll probably mention as we go along here is that I think we're really just at the tip of the iceberg of starting to look at this data now and really encourage you and look forward to the health community more generally, really getting into this data and really trying to understand some new insights about Australia's population, how it's changing and how health conditions are affecting it. So what did this question show about Western Australia? Well, it showed that a little over a quarter of Western Australians reported having a long-term health condition, slightly more than 1 in 4. And on the right here, you can see a breakdown. It was nearly 500,000 people with one health condition, about 142,000 with 2 health conditions, and 68,000 people that reported 3 or more health conditions. This rate of 26% is slightly below the Australian rate of 27.7, so nearly 28%. So one of my takeaways of looking at this data is that I might need to consider a move west. It seems to have a good correlation with lower long-term health conditions. Stepping into looking at 5 of these conditions broken down by age group, the percentage of people listing these conditions in each age group, for Western Australia. This chart is showing data for Western Australia. So we can see 3 of these conditions. The orange bold worm there jumping up over the top of everyone else, that's the arthritis worm. And so you can clearly see in that an age relationship. So very few people or below the age of 20 are reporting arthritis, starting to get up to around 10% in the 50 to 59-year-olds. And then by the time we're in our 80s or older, it's about 35% of the population are experiencing arthritis. Similarly, diabetes, the sort of light teal kind of colour in the middle there, has an age relationship too, with a bit of a later life peak. But there's quite a bit of reporting in the 30s and the 40s of people with diabetes, and there is a lower proportion in the 90 pluses years, suggesting some morbidity there of people with diabetes. Similarly, heart disease has higher age range, so features in the higher age ranges. So this time peaking sort of in the 80 to 100-year age groups in terms of a proportion of response for population. When you look at these numbers, remember that there are a lot more people or in the ages 40 to 70 than there are people who are 70 to 100. So whilst there's a lower percentage of that population group, if we looked at this from a basis of counts, there'd be quite high counts in some of those age groups. in each of these three areas, arthritis, diabetes and heart disease, the proportion of a population in Western Australia reporting these conditions is lower than that of Australia. Nearly a percentage lower for arthritis, but about 1/3% lower for diabetes and heart disease. A couple of them which follow different patterns. Asthma, the yellow line. So as is probably unsurprising, children do have asthma. And so the line for asthma stays relatively steady from 0 through to 100 plus. A little bit lower in the 0 to 9 years is compared to 10 to 19, but then it stays pretty steady and it's not something that disappears. People, a proportion of a population, about 8% in Australia, 7.3% in Western Australia, have asthma across all age kind of groups. A bit of a different pattern again is mental health. So mental health is the condition most likely to be reported from everyone from the age of 20 through to 49. So its peak there is in that young adult kind of age group. And for reporting here across a whole population is about 8.8% for Australia, but only 8.3% for Western Australia. But the patterns here and the patterns across each of these are very similar by age, whether you're looking at Western Australia or whether you're looking at Australia as a whole. Now, doing our favourite trick of zooming in a little bit, we can see a picture here of mental health conditions. And so this is the proportion of each of these SA3s that are reporting a mental health condition. And we can see sort of a bit of a opposite kind of picture to one of the charts that Caroline showed earlier, where the highest proportion of reported mental health is right down in the southwest corner, down near Albany and down at Bunbury and Manjimup, each of those nearly at 10%. Whereas the rates in Kimberley and Pilbara are much lower, with around 4%. Now, we try to unpack this a little bit further, and it's a little bit surprising in some ways. As you saw on that previous slide, usually a younger population might have higher reporting of mental health, whereas we have actually an older population in that southwest corner and a younger population further up north. In some of these SA3s, like in the Pilbara, there is a higher proportion male than female. And in general, what we've seen is that females have a higher reporting of all long-term health conditions, and particularly mental health conditions. So that might explain some of the difference. We do have some challenges in some of the areas of Pilbara and Kimberley getting fully completed forms. And so some level of blank responses from households or incomplete forms might contribute to this percentage a small amount. But this is one of those examples where I think there is worthwhile doing some more work here to try and unpack and understand some of these differences. Now, zooming in to the Perth kind of region, you can see one that a lot more sort of solid colour here. So we're still looking at mental health, we're still looking at an SA3 level. And so generally we're all in these oranges or dark oranges across Perth. In some of the southern areas of Perth, Mandurah, Rockingham, Kwinana, it's pushing up to the 10% kind of mark. Also in Fremantle, 9.9%. But then lower rates in Cottesloe, Claremont, Canning, 6.3%, 6.6%. So which are quite significant differences. It's nearly a 50% higher rate in some areas versus other areas in the Perth region. The second new question we had on the census was a question on service in the Australian Defence Force. So we worked really closely with the Department of Veteran Affairs here, and they have a critical role in supporting Australia's former service men and women across the country. And they have very good records of about 270,000 service people that they do active support for, but they know that there are a number of people who have served the Australian Defence Force who have never enrolled in sort of support services afterwards. And so felt it was really important to capture a more complete picture of our former service people. And so what we saw in the census was that 2.6% of the Western Australian population aged 15 years and over have served in the Australian Defence Force. So that includes nearly 7,000 that are currently serving persons in the Defence Forces and 55,500 previously serving. And so of those which are currently serving, they're nearly all usually resident in and around Perth. 6,300 of that 6,900 live in Perth. The former service population, though, are spread more or across the state aid of WA. And so, and calling out, I guess, a particular area where there's a high concentration of both currently serving and previously serving would be Rockingham, 2,200 currently serving and 4,700 previously serving. So that's about 1 in 15 of the population in Rockingham have served, are serving currently or have previously served. And that is to do with the location of bases. But then you have other areas like Albany. So Albany has about 1,600 people who reported they previously served, but only 50 currently serving. So about 3% of the population of Albany are currently serving. I know Albany has a special place in Australia's military history as the port where the ships are parked in on their way to Gallipoli. So still a strong connection there, and we're currently serving the former serving population. Stepping on into households and families, and as we say at the ABS, you can't choose your family, but you can certainly count them. And so stepping in, we break down households in Australia between family households, lone person households, and group households. And as you can see here, the vast majority of households in Australia are occupied by a family. Around 70% of the households in Western Australia, 71.2%, just marginally higher than Australia at 70.5%. And nearly a quarter of households, both in Australia and in Western Australia, just over a quarter, are lone person households. So one person living alone in a household. And that's a number which has increased over time. It was only 20% of households in Australia if we go back to 1991. So over the last 30 years, it's been growing as a proportion of the households, just as the number of households have increased. So the actual count of lone person households have gone up considerably during that time. Then breaking down about 70% of households that are families into what those family households look like. There's 703,000 families in Western Australia, and 45% of them are couples with children, and 35% are couples without children, and 15% are lone parent families, so one parent and at least one child. Couples without children are both couples that haven't had children yet, but also empty nesters, couples where children might have already left home. The makeup of families has changed in the past 25 years. The proportion of couples with no children has increased from 35% in 1996 up to 39% here, and lone parent families was up from about 14% to 15%. So not really fast change, but consistent and kind of change over time. The SA3 in Western Australia that stood out for me was Wanneroo, has the most couple families of children in Western Australia. So up north of Perth, nearly 29,000 couple families of children. That's nearly 50%, or just over 50% of all families, as well as 10,000 lone parent families, which is over 17% of families. So 70% of all families in Wanneroo have children in the household. So obviously quite different needs in that community compared to some of the other communities across Perth. One area that has changed more quickly when it comes to family the structure is the number of married and de facto same-sex couples in Australia. In the census, we don't ask about sexual orientation. We just collect data on families and relationships within a household. So this is a count of a number of same-sex couples who live together. In the census, it won't capture same-sex couples which are living across multiple households in the same way as it doesn't count yet other couples which live across multiple households. Now, this largely reflects population kind of size. New South Wales is the largest state and has the largest number of same-sex couples. Interestingly, here is the green area. So with the marriage law changing in 2017, we had registered Australian same-sex marriages since then. We see that across Australia, about 30% of all same-sex couples living together reported that are married. In Western Australia, this is a bit higher, 33.5% and of couples reporting as married. Maybe some COVID effects there where marriages might have been more restricted in some jurisdictions than others over the last few years. And then looking at the Western Australia picture here, you can see that the growth back from 1996, when we first collected data on same-sex couples in the Australian census, has increased significantly. Between 2016 and 2021, there's been a 67.6% growth in Western Australia. That compares to 67.7% nationally, so very, very close. Those very similar increases, a 50% increase in 2011 in Western Australia, and some 800% growth over the last 25 years in WA as a whole. Time for me to hand back to the lovely Caroline to tell you a little bit about dwellings in the census.
Thank you, Duncan. So I'm going to finish off talking about dwelling-related data. So when we do the census, it's not just the census of population, it is the census of population and housing. So I'm going to finish off with some data about the dwellings in which we live. But I will just give a reminder about the question stream that we've got going. We have got a lot of questions coming in, but we will be moving to questions shortly. So if you have got any questions, a reminder of that address. It's pollev, pollev.com/2021 census DSWA, and you'll see that URL under the census logo on each of the slides as we progress through. So yeah, get your questions in because we're on standby to answer them for you. Right, on to the dwellings data. And first of all, looking at how we pay for the dwellings that we live in. And people in Western Australia, the most common type of tenure is owned with a mortgage. So this is much higher than we see across Australia. So 40% of all dwellings in Western Australia are owned with a mortgage. Owned outright, a smaller number there, 29.2, and the rental numbers are actually low compared to the rest of Australia, so 27.3, just more than a quarter of the dwellings are rented, and that compares to just over 30% in Australia. Let's look at that over time, but by numbers rather than by proportions. Here on the graph, I've got on the very left, right back in 1996, and then on the right, 21 and 2016. And here the dark orange bar shows the number of dwellings that were owned outright. And in 1996, it was about 230,000. It increased a little bit to 250,000 in 2016. So over that 20-year period, only an increase of 20,000 dwellings were owned outright, and then another increase over the last 5 years to 281,000 dwellings owned outright in 2021. And so you can see what has really shifted over that last period, that last 25 years, is the number of dwellings that are owned with a mortgage. So the entire dwelling stock has increased a lot to just under 1 million occupied dwellings, private dwellings counted in last year's census, and the majority of them now in Western Australia are owned with a mortgage. That's 386,000 dwellings owned with a mortgage, and then the rental numbers just creeping up a little bit. Unoccupied dwellings is a topic that's got quite a bit of interest in the media recently. So we collect data from dwellings, and there are quite a number of dwellings that aren't occupied on census night. And so for those dwellings, we give them a status of unoccupied, which means that we can count how many dwellings there are in Australia. But the unoccupied dwellings, that relates just to dwellings unoccupied on census night. So they may be, for example, holiday homes. You might find that someone's lives most of the time in their house in the Perth suburbs, and they might have a holiday home on the coast somewhere. And on census night, middle of winter, Tuesday night in winter, maybe there aren't so many people living in their holiday houses, so we might find some more unoccupied dwellings in those regions. They also include dwellings that have maybe been newly built and not quite moved into yet. They're ready to be occupied, but no one's moved in just yet, or maybe it's a house undergoing renovation, so the tenants have moved out and haven't moved back in yet, or there could be dwellings that are ready for demolition. So there's quite a number of reasons why a dwelling would be unoccupied on census night. There are, of course, a number in there that are actually available for rent, so available for people who are currently looking for a home. But just showing you here the proportion of unoccupied dwellings over that same time period, the last 25 years. And I'm comparing here Western Australia in the teal colour to Australia in the orange bar. So Western Australia had about 10.4% of dwellings were unoccupied on census night last year, which was quite a bit down from the 2016 figure, which is about 13%. So a decrease in the proportion of unoccupied dwellings. There were 118,000 unoccupied on census night last year. It is a slightly higher rate than we see in Australia. It was 9.6% in Australia in 2021, but back in 2016, the proportions were much more similar. Having a look now at, the dwelling structure. And here we're comparing it to the last 20 years. So 2001 on the left and 2021 on the right, and Perth on the leftmost column, and then the rest of Western Australia on the right. And we collect data on the structure of the dwelling. So that is it a separate house? Is it a townhouse or a flat or apartment? And that dark teal colour represents separate houses. And you can see that in Perth in 2021, about 3/4 of all dwellings were separate houses, down proportionally a little bit on 2001, but still a very high number of separate houses. And in fact, Perth has the greatest proportion of people living in separate houses or separate houses in Australia, except for Hobart. So Hobart was actually quite a bit higher. Hobart is actually 83.8, so Perth's some way behind that, but ahead of all the other capital cities. Then when we look at the rest of Western Australia, you can see that the rate of people living in separate houses is higher. Again, the dark orange bar there is semi-detached or townhouses, and that's the next biggest proportion and hasn't changed much over the last 20 years. But what has changed right at the top of the chart, which you can't see very clearly, but there's a beige colour right at the top of the chart, and that's flats or apartments in a 4 or more story block. On the left in 2001, in Perth, there were very few people, very few apartments in a 4 or more story block, and that more than tripled since in 2021. So it's now about 35,000 dwellings, or about 4% of all dwellings are actually in a flat or apartment in a 4 or more story block. So quite a change there. I don't think you can even see that registering in the rest of Western Australia chart. And the final slide on data is just a quick summary of income and housing measures that we've got in the census. So we collect income from every person aged over 15, and so we can then report that by the personal income. And so the top figure there is that median personal income reported weekly. So $848 was the median personal income in Western Australia last year, and that's increased from 724, so a 17.1% increase. The rate of inflation across Australia at that time was just under 10%, so not quite twice the rate of inflation, but a fairly steady increase in personal income. And that 848 is higher than the Australian median personal income, which is $805. Household income, again, we can add up the incomes of all the people who live in a household. And so that number there has also increased over the last 5 years to about 1,815. Again, that's quite a bit higher than the Australian average, which is about 1,750. And then on the other side of the ledger, we look at the housing costs. So there is median rent, which has actually gone down in the last five years from $350 a week to $340. Again, that $340 is higher than the Australian median weekly rent, which was about $315. But seeing that go down is quite an interesting observation. If I recall the Australia figures, that went up by nearly 10%. And then the median mortgage repayment, this time looking at the monthly mortgage repayment, and that's also gone down, and that's gone down from just under $2,000 to $1,842, so a decrease of 7.6% over the last 5 years. And one thing to know when we're talking about the mortgage repayments, the data that is collected on the census, is we ask people, how much did you spend on your mortgage? So how much did you pay off your mortgage? And so that isn't actually the minimum repayment amount, but that's how much they paid off their mortgage. So some people may have been taking advantage of the lower interest rates that we've seen in recent times and paid a greater amount off their mortgage than they actually needed to. So that's a really good thing to remember if you're analysing any data about mortgage repayments that's come from the census. So that is all the data we're going to present today, but I will tell you now about what's coming up next, because that is only the first part of the census release. We have talked today about quite a number of topics. So on the left column there are all the topics that we released on the 28th of June in our first release. And we haven't talked about them all, but we've mentioned quite a few of them today. On the 12th of October, we are going to be releasing data from our next set of topics. That'll be all the labour force information. We'll be publishing information about non-school qualifications, so the level of education that a person has or their field of study. One that I'm looking forward to seeing is the method of travel to work, and given the COVID restrictions in place across many parts of Australia, I expect we'll see quite a bit of variation in how people got to work or whether they worked from home on census night. So that's coming out in October. We also ask about workplace address, and another one that I think will reflect some really good COVID stories will be internal migration. And what that means is, where did people live 1 year ago and 5 years ago? So anecdotally, we hear stories about people moving out of, say, Melbourne and Sydney into the regions or into other states. And what we'll be able to reveal on the 12th of October is how has that changed and what are the characteristics of the people who have moved in the last year and the last 5 years. And then we keep going with our data releases. Next year, we continue to release data that is a little bit more complex to produce. So you may be familiar with the CEFA. The CEFA is the socioeconomic indexes for areas. It's a measure of advantage and disadvantage. That'll be released next year. Estimates of homelessness, calculating the distance people travel to work, a longitudinal data set, and finally a calculation of remoteness areas, another level of geography that we add to our collection. We've gone through just a sneak peek of some of the data that is available from the census, but would encourage you to look for it yourself if you haven't already started looking on the ABS website for census data. And we have got a couple of ways in to get the data. If you go to the Find Census Data page, you can either navigate by topic, which is a new feature for this census. So if you wanted to look at housing, for example, you click on the topic of housing and there'll be various links under there about housing related variables, data cubes attached to those pages. Any articles that we've produced will be linked in there. So if you're interested in a particular topic, have a look at it by topic. But a lot of time people like to access census by area, and that's one of the real powerful parts of the census, the fact that we collect data from all 25.4 million people across the country. And so you can drill down to any local area. You might be interested in your local suburb, your local government area, or any of the statistical geographies that we have in the census. And so you can do that in that search census data by geography that you can see on the right. The other tool that is very popular that we haven't released just yet is Table Builder. So Table Builder is a tool that allows you to pretty much drag and drop in all your variables so you can construct your own tables. So that wasn't released on the 28th of June, but we're working really hard to get that out to you fairly soon. We have got a page on our website on Table Builder that we post the updates to. So I haven't got a date that I can confirm yet, but keep an eye on that Table Builder page on the website to get more information. And of course, if you are already a registered Table Builder user, you'll be getting emails as we get an update in that status. And the final slide is the Census Dictionary, which is a really valuable tool to help you understand the data that you're accessing and using. So every single variable that we release has a page on it in the Census Dictionary, and we talk about quite a number of things for each variable. So we'll define that variable. We'll talk about the scope that variable applies to. For example, is it a variable that only applies to people aged over 15? We'll have copies of the questions that were asked on the census form to yield that data, how it's changed over time, and things to be aware of when you're using the data, including things like the item non-response rate. So I really encourage you to have a look at that Census Dictionary to find out more about the variables, and particularly the couple of new variables that we've got from the new questions on the Australian Defence Force and health. And we also have a number of new variables on existing topics. So we've got a lot of new variables associated with closing the gap. And we've also added quite a few family variables. So a good source of information is the Census Dictionary. And now I'm going to hand over to Aoife, who is going to take us through the questions that have been posed to us today. Thanks, Aoife.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Duncan, for the terrific presentations. We're getting lots of questions in through PollEV, so we'll kick off for the next 20 minutes or so, or maybe 15 minutes if people can hang on. So we'll start with what is the fastest growing religion in WA? Caroline, would you like to take this question?
Yes, thanks. And I did have a heads up that question was coming, so I have had a quick look at it, and it wasn't a religion that we had on the slides. It was actually Sikhism. So Sikhism grew by 56.2% between 2016 and 2021. So there's now 18,500 people in Western Australia who describe their religious affiliation as Sikhism.
Fantastic. Thank you, Caroline. Next question. How can I learn more about the long-term health data and what it tells us? Caroline or Duncan? Who'd like to take this one?
I can start here, thanks. So to go to our website, and I'd suggest doing two things. One, look at our articles, and we've published an article about long-term health conditions, and so both an article to help you understand the conceptual side of long-term health conditions, as well as article to understand the data. So that's where we pull out some of the information that we've got from a question and add a little bit of commentary and explanation of it. Two, jump in and access the data. And I saw there was a question there about, is that data freely available? Absolutely it is. And the question said, is it available at SA2 level? Absolutely it is. So to jump in there, you can get either the quick stats, which has a high level summary of the long-term health conditions, or you can open up a community profile that gives you a lot more detail, or a number of different worksheets that break down long-term health conditions a little bit further. We also have a seminar planned and on long-term health conditions. So in the same place you found out about this seminar on the ABS website, we'll be promoting a seminar about health data, which will really go into quite a bit more detail on the long-term health conditions question. So that's where I'd start.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Duncan. So now our next one, we have a COVID question. Given the COVID impacts and border closures during the census, how did you manage engagement in Western Australia?
In a lot of different ways. We do have a lot of people on the ground during the running of a census. So we're fortunate enough as the ABS to have staff in every capital city across the country, and so we have an office in Perth, and we have a partnership manager in Perth who does a lot of work with Western Australian and local government and state government. So that's an enduring kind of engagement and connection. In addition to that, in the lead up to a census, we engage from our national census team across a number of different people who participate in helping us complete the census. In 2021, a lot more of that was done virtually than in previous censuses. We used to be able to get on a flight and get across to Perth and be able to sit down, whereas we had to use Microsoft Teams or Zoom or other kind of platforms to reach out and engage. But then as the census gets closer, we employ a lot of people on the ground and in different communities, from the collectors at the doorstep to the managers and people in more engagement roles, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander liaison managers. And those engagement managers really help us with that kind of outreach and connection, and making sure we sort of get the local connection across different communities. Certainly not saying that COVID, it wasn't a big challenge. Certainly it has posed some challenges for us, but what we saw was a really great level of support by the community.
Thank you, Duncan. And our next question, what is the ABS going to do to address the Indigenous undercount? Is there something WA can do to help improve this? Yeah,
a really good question, and it's a big challenge. For this census, it wasn't something which I think we've covered yet today, but this census had a slight improvement, but a similar undercount of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people compared to 2016, so about a 17% undercount. And so that's not something we're comfortable with at the ABS, and something that we're happy with. It put a lot of effort in the build up to 2021 to try and reduce that. And in reality, I think the undercount would have got a lot worse with COVID conditions if we hadn't put all of those efforts in place. But we weren't able to see the significant improvements in undercount, despite seeing a large increase in count. Can Western Australia do anything to support? Well, I think it's something that we all need to be involved with, at making sure that we get the right people on the ground and working as part of a census. Certainly, as we get into remote communities, is having local facilitators who have trust and relationships in community is so important to the census. But even in our urban centres and in our capital cities, having the right people involved to make sure that there's an understanding of the value of a census, the importance of a census, and make sure that our approaches are tailored, our support sites in the right places to provide support. I think it is something that we need to work together collectively, because we do want the census to have a full count of everyone in the country.
Thank you, Duncan. Our next question sort of ties into the response that you've just provided. So what were some of the recruitment challenges in this census, and did the community rise to the challenge? Would you like to add anything further, Duncan, to that one?
Yeah, so it was probably two different challenges we saw in COVID. One, across the country, we saw very low levels of unemployment, and so it is hard to fill positions, and we had to reach out to a number of organisations to help us out, and to local development authorities, councils, state government, and did offer a fair bit of assistance in promoting positions or making staff available. But the other challenge for us in 2021 was usually where if we had areas where there was a shortage of staff, we could fly staff in, and we could do that within Western Australia, but it was much harder because of the border restrictions to move people between territories. And so that does make it very challenging on the ground, particularly in more or remote locations. But I guess the second part of the question is that we think people did really rally to support the census. About 96.2% response rate in Western Australia is an amazing kind of response rate kind of level. We know that when we reached out to grey nomads and mobile people travelling around the country, we got a number of extra people who were involved who helped us out and worked for a census from that community. And so there was certainly a level of support. But yet, if the labour market conditions stay the same, it's something that we definitely need good strategies for Census 2026.
Thank you, Duncan. Are the long-term health data available online, and can we get it at the SA2 level? Caroline, I think this might be a question for you.
I feel that I should take some of the pressure off of Duncan. let him have a sip of water. So yes, there is quite a lot of data available about the long-term health conditions online and available at the SA2 level. So what you can do if you're searching by your local area, you can find the health data in the quick stats for that area by just entering your local suburb or postal area, for example, or your SA2, or you can look at the community profile and see the data there as well. And we have also packaged a lot of the health data together in that health topics page. So there's a data cube that is attached to that page that also has a lot of health data, not down at a very low level, but good health summary of all the health data. And I should say that the health question, there's just one question asked, but lots of variables that we're able to produce from that. So a richness of data on the long-term health condition is available on the website.
Fantastic. Thanks, Caroline. So this is a question for both of you, I guess. What were the most unusual or surprising findings in the WA data? And Duncan, I might go to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, no worries. I'll try and add a new one that we haven't shared yet today. I do find that the cultural diversity of Western Australia quite noticeable, and Caroline, I think, highlighted that really well in her presentation. But one of the ones which I guess rarely stands out in our data is for a change in male-female sex ratios. And so if we go back to 2011, and I think in sort of full swing of mining boom, Western Australia had about 13,000 more males and females in the state. And if we go forward to 2021, there's now about 13,000 more females than males in the state. So it's quite unusual for us to see male-female ratios change, but it does just show the significance of the mining boom and employment related to that for a period of time. So I think that seeing that ratio sort of have swung the other way was quite a noticeable or interesting part of the Western Australian census data.
And I might change tack again to something completely different and maybe not too surprising for people who live in Western Australia. But one thing that I had a look at the data was the number of motor vehicles that people have. And I guess for the vastness of the whole state and even the vastness and spread of the Greater Capital City area, probably not surprising that Western Australia own more cars or have more registered cars than Australians overall. And so the most common, 39% of all dwellings in Western Australia have two motor vehicles. Another 20% have three or more. So, and very few, less than 5%, have no motor vehicles. So I thought that was quite interesting, and I guess you need the cars to get around.
Brilliant. Thanks, Caroline. So how has the census been collected in mining areas specifically? Caroline, is this one for you, or Duncan? I'll leave it up to you both to decide.
I'll kick off. Each mining area is a little bit different, but generally in mining areas you will have some non-private dwellings, so some accommodation and sort of provided by a mining company or sort of support services around the mining companies. So we do reach out and work with each of the non-private dwellings. So like we do with a hotel anywhere else in the country to have someone on site to support the undertaking of the census in that site. So they provide us with summary information of who should be staying in that site on census night, and then they also help us with the distribution of census forms and login codes for people to be able to complete the census online, and we're then able to use that information together to make sure that we've got a complete picture. You'll see in census data usually in places where there's non-private dwellings, whether that's in a hotel in a capital city or in an employee kind of residence, we won't get quite as good a response rate as we do in private dwellings. And so we use the summary information and other administrative data to make sure that we add into the census count people that we haven't got a completed census form to make sure that the data is as complete as possible. The other part, which I think is really important to remember with mining in mining areas, mining camps, is that we collect data about where people usually live, as well as where obviously where they're filling out the form on census night, in order to make sure that most of the data that people use from a census and all the data we presented today is based on a usual residence basis. So if people are a fly-in, fly-out worker, we'll move them back to their usual location to make sure that they're counted in the area community that they're usually resident at. So if you look at the census data with usual residence data versus the census night kind of data, you'll be able to see some significant differences in some mining areas where there might have been a lot of people on census night, but that's not what their usual home is. Caroline, did you want to add anything over to that?
No, Duncan, I think that was a really thorough answer.
That's great, thank you. So our next question. Unlike ancestry, should long-term health conditions need to be calculated for population, not against total response rate?
I can take that one, and I would actually rephrase that question because I think it is like ancestry. So what's being picked up there is that both ancestry and the health question allow multiple responses. Ancestry, you can choose up to 2 ancestries. So I don't think I said that when I was talking about the cultural diversity, but you can nominate the two ancestries that you identify with. So if you add up all the responses, that gets to more than 100% of the population. And likewise with the health question, there are 10 different health conditions that are listed on there. And so when you add up all the responses, again, adds up to more than 100% of the population. So for both ancestry and for health, the figures that we've presented today are of the total population. So if we said that about 10% of people reported a mental health condition, I think it was just under, Duncan had that figure, 8.8%, then that is of 8.8% of all Australian people, not of all people who gave a response on the health question. So we do have a very useful article on our website all about calculating non-response and how to use the various other codes that are available in the data, like the not stateds or the not further defines. And you can find that on our website under the articles part of the website if you need a bit more guidance on how to do those calculations.
Thank you, Caroline. So back to recruitment for our next question. Could you comment on the ABS's decision to use a centralised staffing model for the 2021 census? And do you think it was to the detriment of the Western Australian count, particularly given the pandemic? The net undercount for Western Australia seems to show the largest increase from 2016 for all states and territories. For context, this question is from a regional contract worker during the 2021 census and the 2016 census.
Thanks, Eva. It's probably a good question for me. Firstly for context, the question might make it sound like we had all of our staff central in 2021, and that certainly wasn't the case. Like every census, the work needs to happen and on the ground, and the vast majority of staff were recruited from local communities, local towns, local suburbs in order to support the count of a census. So of your 34,000 census kind of field staff, it'd be something in the order of 33,000 of them are uncentralised, but they're out working on the ground and in the field across the country. The change for the question, and is sort of correct out, is that rather than having state-based coordination units in previous censuses, we went to having a central coordination unit in order to both support efficiency, but also to support making sure that we had sort of a nationally consistent approach and a national approach to the priorities during census collection. And so that offers a lot of advantages, but we saw some challenges in previous censuses where sometimes the data wasn't always completely comparable from state to state. I think for the undercount in Western Australia is something that we do need to focus on as we go forward to 2026 census. The 2016 census had a really great result for Western Australia. We had things worked really well in Western Australia. The 2011 census didn't go that well in Western Australia by comparison. And so we've got a couple of censuses now to reflect on and work out what our best approaches are. Certainly, as a number of other questions have highlighted, the challenges in both the labour market and being able to move people into and out of a state, whether we had a local team or not, would have caused problems when we didn't have local labour available in particular areas. So I think some of those same challenges would have existed anyway, but it's certainly something that we'll work on as we go forward. We want to get the undercounts in every state as low as possible.
Thank you, Duncan. Our next question is about unoccupied dwellings. So how was unoccupied dwellings information captured, particularly in the Pilbara and Kimberley region and more remote areas?
I might take that one. That is a really good question, because I did say when I was talking about dwellings that it's important for us to not just count the people, but also count the dwellings, including when those dwellings are unoccupied. Now, obviously, a dwelling can't write back to us and tell us itself that it's not occupied. So we've got a range of different ways where we determine that. Sometimes we have people will the owners of that dwelling will report it unoccupied themselves. So I gave an example of people who maybe live in the Perth suburbs and have a dwelling on the coast somewhere, a holiday home. And so that holiday home would also be delivered instructions to participate in the census, and the person who's not at that dwelling can either call us or report online to say that they weren't, that dwelling wasn't occupied. So that's one of the really common ways that we get information about which dwellings aren't occupied. And another way is through field staff follow-up. So we will keep delivering forms or delivering instructions to all dwellings until we get a response. And we do that by mail in the first instance. And then eventually we have people go out and knock on the doors to ask for a response. So when those people are going out to get that response, they make observations about whether the dwelling has been occupied or not. And so they're probably the two main ways that we determine whether dwellings are occupied or unoccupied on census night.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you, Duncan, both for your time and presentation today. We've gotten through all the questions on Poll EV now. So that brings today's seminar to a close. For anyone who has a question after the event, feel free to send it through to our customer support team. So client.services@abs.gov.au, the email address on that closing slide on your screen, and we'll get back to you within the coming days. If you really enjoyed today's seminar, there's lots more to come with our topic-based seminars, as Caroline mentioned earlier. So keep an eye out on the ABS website for more details. And we'll have a recording available on the website with today's seminar, and the slides will be available for download in the coming days. So keep an eye on that. Thanks for joining us today. Bye for now.